Yes.
Excellent. Great. Great to see so many people in person. Welcome to today, I guess. And this is actually Norwegian ground for those who don't know. So you can tell your wives or your husbands today that you've actually been to Norway. And I think it's true. At least that's what I'm telling my folks back in Norway. I'm actually working in Norway over here. We have a pretty busy agenda today. The first hour is just to give a quick update with some key takeaways on the joint industry project we've been having this year, and a few things related to Whitson Plus in general that's new. Then we're jumping straight into these knowledge sharing presentations. The event is hybrid, so there is people online that I see here on the screen. So the presenters are both sharing the screen behind me here with the people here in the audience, and of course also the people on Teams. And just remember, everyone in the audience, we're sharing that. So we're trying to, at least if you present virtually, if you show some body language like this doesn't make sense and stuff, they'll see it. So that's a good thing. A few things on meeting logistics. We have more than 100 registered participants. We're almost close to 50 people here in person. And then we have probably something similar online. So if the people that's on Teams can just, Mo, for instance, help to make sure that people who are not presenting are muted when not talking. And if you have any questions during your presentations, specifically on Teams, it would be great to ask those in the Q&A box, and we can facilitate that thereafter. When you are presenting virtually, there's 3 virtual presentations. That would be great if they can use the video while they're presenting. That'd be great. And as mentioned, the meeting will be recorded and distributed after the call. Some parts of some of you have asked to not to distribute the presentation and recording, so some parts will be also kept out. The program before lunch is just a quick introduction for today, and then we're jumping straight into 3 presentations. First, Louisa from Birchcliff, then Ryan from Coursera, and then Marcus from Whitson. And then the second session is with Brock and Stian and Jason, all on different topics relevant to what we're here for, to talk about RTA. After lunch, it's an even more packed schedule, so that's why it's important with a good hour for lunch to make sure everybody is energized for the second half. So first out there, it's Zach, and then Jordan and Ruth, and then the second session after lunch is Brian, Jaron, which is a virtual presentation, and then Craig. Before the last part, that's when we're the most tired, everyone in the room here, so we have to do the things that are the most fun. So the first thing is going to be Brian, Jason, and Braden. They're going to do basically a workflow presentation on the same well. And then I'm just going to summarize how similar or different it is, or how consistent it is. And then we're going to have a panel discussion on more practical perspectives. So after a little break between this and that, we'll have both Claudia, Bruce, Gustavo, and Stephen at the podium here, and we'll ask them some very, very difficult questions. But it's going to be all about more practical aspects of doing well performance analysis in general. Then at 4:30, we'll go. There will be a dinner for those that are here in person. So that's all the breakfast, lunch, and dinner is served by our friend Søren and his team. So he's a Danish chef. We couldn't find a Norwegian chef for some reason. And then just after that, we'll just walk across the street. It's literally just across the street here to Flight Club. If you guys have parked here in the parking garage, the way to get out of that parking garage is just to drive the car very close to the gate here, and it opens automatically, so you don't need anything to get out. The first thing before we go through really kind of some key takeaways is just we have some people that do RTA almost every day that uses Whitson Plus or equivalent tools every single day, so this might be a little bit of repetition, but I just want to make sure that everybody has at least a little refresher when it comes to RTA, because if not, following through this day, following some of the presentations that will be, showing some few advanced concepts and at least some abbreviations will be a little bit tough. So the first thing I would just like to do is to give a little crash course on RTA, not as long as we typically do, just 10 minutes or something, just so we make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. But the first thing is just to define what RTA is. like rate transit analysis. What is it actually? Because when we say RTA, it's so many different meanings for different people. So if I come to someone to, what is RTA to Manuel, he might say, yeah, RTA is diagnostics, for instance. And what does that really mean? Well, I use it to identify flow regimes, okay? And that's one use case of RTA. And then I might come to Stephen, and he doesn't use it much for diagnostics, for instance, but he uses it to compare relative well performance between wells. But he accounts for this difference in pressure drawdown. So those things are fundamentally very different use cases of RTA, but it's kind of different takeaways. Then I come to Braden, and he is all about quantifying the LFP and contacted pore volume, which it has nothing to do necessarily with. I mean, there's some diagnostics implicitly there, so you need to do the diagnostics, and you use it to relatively compare well performance between wells. But that's something that you can uniquely derive from the work itself. Then a last thing, which I think we get confused about sometimes, is this, when we used to resolve parameters, so reservoir parameters. And that's like almost like a fourth dimension of RTA to some degree. Like, okay, we have a LFP, we have an OIP, we like to estimate our XF or PERM, for instance. But when we do or make those judgments or realizations, we have to remember that these are just one of an infinite number of ways to solve for those unknowns when we have a certain A root K and contacted pore volume. Okay, and we also have to know that if you want to do this correctly, we actually have to be have observed full boundary dominated flow, which we don't actually do in a lot of these wells. So that's stuff that we'll talk more about today. So when we talk about RTA, first, some people are like, yeah, RTA is super useful, and then when they say RTA, maybe they only talk about flow regime identification. And then maybe some other people are like, yeah, I tried to resolve some parameters down here, but it didn't make sense when I compared it to something else that I saw in the field. So RTA is very different from different people. So just make sure that we have the context before we start to talk about it. So these are kind of the way I think about it, or group it at least. So when it comes to this event marks kind of the end of the ongoing numerical RTA GIP. And then early next month, we're starting just a follow-up consortium, which we call this multi-phase RTA consortium. It's the same group or just a larger group. So we had 30 plus companies in the last one, and will be probably 40 plus for this one. What are the difference? Well, we have a little bit broader scope in terms of the technologies that we like to continue developing and evaluating. So it's numerical RTA, multi-phase flow material balance, and without rail perms, and it's fractional RTA. That's the general RTA technologies that we'll work further on in this next follow-up. But there is also, in terms of general things that we'd like to add into the software and also study more, as multi-well models. So both multi-well numerical models, being able to run those fast in the cloud. So not having to run a model that takes multiple days, but having models that can take a couple of minutes to run. So fairly, simplified, but they honor the changing boundary conditions with different drawdown profiles, and also the total rates on a pad level. The second thing is water, handling of water. That's something that always comes up. It's going to be interesting. It's also a thing which I saw consistently as a takeaway in all the interpreters that looked at the same well. Everybody had some issues with the water. So that's something in general for all these different techniques that we'll look a little bit more into. So that's the general transition from this numerical RTA to the multi-phase RTA consortium. And it will be very similar. It will be knowledge sharing sessions quarterly. It will be an event like this next year, very similar to this, which will wrap up everything. And then hopefully throughout the year, unless we've solved every single problem in the industry, we might be even a follow-up event from that as well. Just a timeline from what we've done in this consortium. We've had 3 knowledge sharing sessions. We had one in Q1. We also had one in Q2. And then this is the wrap up of the consortium today. And we've also had 4 different software courses on different aspects throughout the year. One has been on PVT items specifically. All of them have been half-day courses. One on bottom hole pressure or pipe flow calculations. One more on specifically RTA. And then we had one last month, which was on this multi-phase flow material balance method. We'll repeat these courses next year, of course, updated with new information. Maybe we'll add in a 5th course as well. And the recordings for this is always available to you if you would like to revisit them later. And they were very well attended. All of the courses had between 50 to 100 participants, which is really, really good. There was a lot of findings throughout this year. Like there's been a lot of, I'm sure the folks that use whitSim Plus a lot as well see that there's been a lot of advancements in terms of new methods, new diagnostics, etc. in the tool. Some of the very detailed parts of it is summarized in 3 different papers. So we presented one paper for URTEC on the multi-phase flow material balance. That was Leslie Thompson and Barry Ruddock that was developing this method when they were at Cimarex or Cotera now, as they summarized all the details there. This is also available in the handouts of the or in the deliverables for the consortium. Then we had one paper where we take numerical RTA from Braden here and we extend it to complex fracture systems. So that's basically we try to marry fractional RTA and numerical RTA. And we made that paper into 2 parts because it was just so long. So we have one that we're presenting part 2 on this for ATCE next week. So all of these are papers that is a pure result of this consortium. For all of you that we've been interacting with many of you on different levels, but all the findings that we've had has been a pure result of the consortium. And just to mention a few things that we've added as a result of the consortium is, for instance, being able to account for geomechanical effects in both the fracture and the matrix in the numerical RTA workflow. Adding in rock compressibility as an input to the multi-phase flow material balance without rel perms. That was super interesting. We had some cases, very, very low compressibility systems in Vaca Muerta, and we saw that it was really, really important to account for this. Multi-layer numerical models, not only petrophysical numerical models, but also having different fluids or PVT in the different layers. Fractional RTA is another thing we've included as a result through these interactions with you all, but is also a lot more. And we're very proud to actually have, I did a counting yesterday just to have a sense of how many wells we've been able to get in with production data. So that's rates of all the phases. And that's actually more than 50,000 wells. And if I took in all the wells where we just have like PVT calculations and stuff, it will be in more than 100,000 wells that we've had in the software throughout this last year. So really good, and so I guess we have really appreciated all the kind of the community and all the feedback that you all been giving. I feel like almost everybody in the room here kind of have their own little feature in the software, or like something that they've requested that we've been able to get in there. So just continue to do that because we take that very seriously, and literally every single feedback we get from you all, we put it in the backlog, and then it's just the priority of when we'll implement it is just a function of how many people have asked for the same thing. And we try our best, like when we have a feature implemented based on a request, to also follow up with people if we've been able to get it in there. Great. So that was a quick update on the consortium that we've had, and we'll also see some other results of that more practical a little bit later. But just so it's easier for you all to digest what is going to be presented here, not by me, because I'm going to present just more basic things, but there are a lot of these presentations later today that will have a lot of, well, they'll probably assume that you know at least a certain amount of RTA. So I just want to make sure everybody is on the same page in the room before we go there. And I'm not going to go into like nitty-gritty equations and everything. I'll try to keep it practical, but I'll also throughout the day repeat a lot of these things as well, because some things are just so fundamental. And I mean, when you work on it every day, you know it, but if you have only just recently been exposed to it, it can be nice to repeat some of it. And the first thing that I always show, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen it a million times, they're like, oh my God, not again, Matthias, but that's how it is. But it's very, very fundamental. And it's the first thing is around flow regimes, that we know and that we have a quantitative relationship to what flow regime we're in for a given well, because it's so important for all the other things you're using or all the methods that you're applying. And flow regimes, there are only three, at least in my world, that's really relevant for tight unconventionals. It's infinite acting flow. So that's when you're draining a tank, but you don't know the size of the tank yet, because where you're draining from hasn't really felt the edges or the boundaries of the tank. And I guess rigorously, we would say that it ends as a pressure transit reaches one of the reservoir boundaries. So if I'm a well over here, and I haven't seen the wall over there yet, but I'm still in infinite acting flow. The total other extreme is that I'm in full boundary dominated flow. So I've actually seen, or I've been impacted, or my tank, I see all the edges of my reservoir. So if I'm a well here and draining this room, I'm seeing every single wall in this room, and I feel it, and it has an impact on my well performance. Rigorously, we would say that starts as pressure propagation has reached all of the reservoir boundaries. And then we have this very important flow regime, and I think that's something that's just been more important and highlighted throughout this consortium is we have something called transitional flow. And transitional flow is just you're in between these two extremes. So you have some parts of your reservoir that's still infinite acting, and you have some parts of your reservoir that's in boundary. And it looks like this power law relationship on well performance. And this is super important and something we'll talk more about a little bit later today. So that means that if I'm a well here, I might have started to feel the boundary or the wall over here, but I haven't felt the wall over there yet, or the wall over there yet, and the wall over there yet. Okay. Second thing is what we can derive from RTA. If you have production data and bottom hole pressures and PVT, if those are the only things you have, you can still do RTA. You don't have to know anything about the height, the well lateral length, etc. You can still do RTA. But the things that you can resolve are only two things. It's your A root K that correlates with, typically early time CUMs, so 1 year CUMs or, 90-day CUMs. And then you have the contacted oil or gas in place. But it's very important to remember, if you don't know the flow regimes, talking about these things doesn't make sense. So your LFP can only be observed if you actually truly observe infinite acting linear flow. And then your contacted oil or gas in place, you have to be in full boundary to be able to say what it is. So if your well is still transitional or infinite acting, like you can't say with certainty what your OGIP is or what your OIP is, and then you can't actually say anything about what your final EUR says because you haven't seen the whole tank. So it's impossible to do that exercise. And that is extremely important because a lot of the wells that we're dealing with, many of them might have seen some boundary effects, but it takes a long time before you're in full boundary or you have very, very tight well spacing to see. When we talk about this, contacted oil and gas in place, don't mix it with petrophysical oil and gas in place. That was a survey earlier in the year. We asked all the companies, if you take the petrophysically mapped oil and gas in place and you compare it to what you resolve from RTA, there's basically a haircut of almost 80 to maybe 60%. So if let's say you have a mapped petrophysical pore volume of 10 million barrels, then what you're actually resolving from RTA exercising could be around 2, for instance. And what do we mean by that? Well, if you have a block of rock where you have a certain size, you have a certain number of hydrocarbons in there, you put in some wells and you complete it, then you're not able to actually contact and drain the entire in-place volume. You're just draining in a portion of that. And that portion is what we through that survey saw was typically between 20 to 40%. What do we call this volume? Well, we also asked that question. Some people call it the contacted pore volume. Some people call it the stimulated rock volume. Some people use a wide range of different terms for it, drained rock volume, or use all of them interchangeably. But just remember that whatever we are deriving from RTA, do not mix it with the petrophysically mapped pore volume. Okay. Talked about many times in this throughout this consortium is these three techniques: numerical RTA, multi-phase flowing material balance, and fractional RTA. We'll not go into any details here, but just when people are showing the slides, I would like to everybody have at least an intuitive impression of how these methods work. Again, there's only two things we can derive. It's the LFP and contacted pore volume. So the first here, numerical RTA, the summary there is the diagnostic plot is very simple. You're just trying to compute numerically your A root K versus time. A flat horizontal line indicates infinite acting linear flow. Deviation below this line represents boundary dominated or transitional flow. And the magnitude of the flat line itself indicates the LFP. And then since you're doing this numerically, you're running a wide range of numerical models. at the same time. This is Braden's paper from 2020. And when you do that, the only difference between these models is the tank size. So you're getting a wide range of type curves at the same time, and your job is not only to pick the LFP, but also to pick the type curve that's closest in terms of contacted pore volume. And you see this here. For this case, it will kind of be this light blue example right here. And you pick the two things you can get from RTA, your LFP and OIP. So that's numerical RTA in a nutshell. Okay. So when people are showing this later, that's it. Multi-phase flow material balance. We know this method. We talked about it many times before. It does not require rel perms. It outputs the contacted oil or gas in place. It does not care about geometry, but it assumes boundary dominated flow or pseudo-steady state. So what does that mean for when you do RTA? Well, it means that you can use it as a lower estimate or the estimate if you're in full boundary. So many times people are like, yeah, I get a much lower original oil in place from my multi-phase FMB to what I just get from numerical RTA. Well, it's probably an indication that you're most likely still in transitional flow or infinite acting, at least transition. So a lot of people here use it to bound RTA work, or at least question your RTA work. And we'll see that's super interesting with the interpreters. That I think everybody did it independently, but all of them used it to kind of question some of their results and did it iteratively from there. The diagnostic plots, super simple. Just some plots on or points on a graph. You're trying to pick the shallowest slope that you see. The inverse of that slope is your pore volume. So this is a small OIP, this is a big OIP, and this is a bigger OIP, and that's it. The equation, I promise no equations, but it is actually super simple. So it looks very dangerous, this equation, but it's actually very simple if you break it down. This is an intercept, material balance time, pore volume, mass rate. So think oil, gas, and water, all added up together in a tank just on a mass basis. And then this is something called mixture density change. What is mixture density? Think you have a tank, oil, gas, and water. They don't actually mix, but you can measure the volume and you can measure the mass. So just think about that. It's kind of like a multi-phase density, if you like. If you multiply mass rate on both sides here, it's actually something that's really dear to our hearts. Density is equal to mass over volume, just multiply. And the beautiful thing about it is that it's also a linear relationship, which is what everyone here in the room likes. You know, if you're an engineer, the dream is to have something that is extremely complex, but it's simplified to a linear relationship. So that's multi-phase flow, highly nonlinear PVT, superposition effects, etc. The big thing about this method is that it does not require rel perms. And that's a question we get a lot, and we spent some time in the course last month to talk about why. Why do we not require rel perms here, and why? And that's obviously unique, right? Because rel perms is something that we really don't have for many rocks, at least in unconventionals. The short answer is this. So rel perms and PVT, what does that give us? These two things together, they give us fluid ratios. And what is fluid ratios? Fluid ratios is water oil ratio, CGR, OGR, you name it. That's fluid ratios. But what we're doing with the multi-phase flow material balance method is that we're actually using the historical data only to back out the fluid ratios. We use the fluid ratios from the field, and we don't need rel perms for that. But if we went into a forecasting exercise from this methodology, then maybe you would need rel perms. But that's also why in that feature in the software, for instance, we're not forecasting based on rel perms. We're just forecasting the fluid ratios versus time. And just to make that 100% clear, if you look at the formula, for instance, for producing GOR, right here, this is producing GOR. This guy right here, that's a solution GOR. These guys right here are just PVT properties. So these are PVT properties. And these guys right here, KRG, KRO, that's rel perms. So fluid ratios, and there's an equivalent equation for all ratios like this. So it's just PVT and rel perm. Okay, and the reason why we don't need it, the short answer, is we're using whatever we have in the field, or if we're doing a forecasting exercise, we forecast the ratios instead of using rel perms. And it's just extrapolating that trend. The last thing is fractional RTA. What's the difference between classical RTA and fractional RTA? Well, classical RTA gives us LFP equal to A root K. And if you think about it, back to school, what is A root K? That's just AK to 0.5. We'll call that term delta, the 0.5 term. And then Jorge from Chevron, he and that group came up with fractional RTA, just a more general way of solving for your LFP. So now in fractional RTA, you can solve for any complex system of fractures, and what you're resolving in terms of LFP is a k to the delta. And it's my analogy is always that, okay, if you do ARPS, the classical RTA forces you to always do ARPS with a B factor equal to 1 on every single fit, and now you're allowed to change it from 2 all the way down to 0. Very simple way of diagnosing the delta for a given well. It's literally just a rate normalized pressure plot versus time. This is exactly the same thing you do on the square root of time plot, by the way. This is just exactly the same thing on the y-axis, but you just do it versus real time and then not square root of time, and you just do it log. So you can do this in Excel very easily in Whitson Plus, etc. And the exponent here, or 1 minus that exponent, that's your delta. And why do we need delta? Well, the physical significance of delta, when delta is 0.5, we're infinite acting. Boundary dominated, delta is 0. So remember, this is all in material balance time. And if you're in transitional flow, the delta is somewhere in between. There's a very nice diagnostics to tell you, okay, where is my well in terms of flow regime? And it's very, very important to do that. Okay? I think everybody now, that was even less than 10 minutes, which is even better. So that's the crash course in terms of at least the new things that people haven't been exposed to before. I'm going to spend 2 minutes on this thing, what I call anomalous confusion. So, there's been a lot of things in the industry the last 10 years, I think, about we need new physics and everything to understand unconventional well performance. And it's been like, classical diffusion doesn't work for the purposes of unconventional rocks. We need new type of physics, typically referred to as anomalous diffusion. So I'll just give a couple of thoughts around that just for the group here. So because it's very relevant for the group. So, when it comes to all of these terms, convection, diffusion, it all leads to confusion in the end of the day. But there is a claim in the industry that unconventional wells do not exhibit classical Darcy behavior, but rather a power law behavior that results from anomalous diffusion. And that's a claim. We all agree that we see power law type of behavior for a lot of unconventional wells, but that's in itself is not an evidence that we're dealing with new physics, anomalous diffusion. Okay? And many of you, we've talked about this many times with many of you in and throughout this project, is that we can go to a pad and you have a wide range of deltas on the same pad. You have some deltas that are 0.5, and then, Darcy flow is perfect. It's not a true power law type of relationship, and it goes into boundary at some point in time. That's like the legacy completions. Then you have some that are like 0.3 power law relationship for their entire life. Then you have some that are exhibiting a delta of 0, so boundary dominated from very early on. My point is that if it was just a rock, or it was something special with the rock, then every single well on that pad, no matter how you completed it, which should give you some indication that the power law type of relationship exists. And we don't see that in reality. We see a mix of it. Okay, and that's going back to getting this type of relationship. Is just you can get that from just a mix of infinite acting flow and boundary dominated flow. Okay, and there can be a lot of things that causes it. So heterogeneity, very easy way to model it. And then, if you add on superposition effects and multi-phase flow effects and whatnot as well, you can get it in many different ways. Okay, so there's not only one answer to that. And just an example here, this is one pad with, so like the rock, everything fluid, rock, everything's the same, but there's different vintages of completion. You have the most tight spacing, well spacing, and cluster spacing give you delta of 0 from day one. Same pad. Then you have like a typical power law relationship for a period of time before it goes into some kind of boundary later on, 0.35. And then you have a very legacy completion, which is a parent well, delta of 0.5, very easy to model with like a classical Darcy type of example. My main point is that if it was a rock, then all of these would exhibit a power law relationship, and we don't see that in general. The last thing I'll go through before we'll open the stage for presenters is just a quick update on whitSim Plus. There is a release this week. We'll go through a few of the highlights there. But in short, for all of you, most of you guys are using it fairly frequently as well. But whitSim Plus is a web-based solution that we try to keep everything into one space with both decline and type well functionality. PVT, bottom hole pressure calculations, flow material balance, RTA, and also full physics numerical simulation. And the last couple of years have gone very, very fast. So a little bit more than 2 years ago, we wrote the first line of code for the software. And since then, we've been extremely lucky to work with, now it's more close to 50 different operators in unconventional. So that's been happening very, very fast. But in general, our mission and what we would like to do there is to just keep it simple. And when we talk about making it simple, it's not only making the user experience very simple, but we want to make everything about the product as simple as we can. So we want to make it one product. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means that all the features that make sense to have in whitSim Plus, we'll keep them in whitSim Plus for that audience. Okay, so that means all the currently developed features and all the future modules. There's also one price, so everyone knows that, with unlimited number of seats. So that's also super simple. It's one interface, and you just find it on the web. So that should be seamless to move from one module to another. And then we have, for most of the companies, also, or at least the companies that would like to have it, a single sign-on. So you just go to your company name.whitsim.com, click single sign-on, and you log in with your basically your email. So we try to keep it simple, not only on the user-friendly side of things, but also when it comes to working with the product and the pricing and so on. The other thing that we try to keep simple is the cloud integration, and that's been very, very successful with at least the companies that have been interested in doing that. And we've done multiple examples this year of API integrations, database connections, or Snowflake share connections, which has been really, really fun. And probably one of the more popular workflows there in terms of automation, which saves us all an extreme amount of time, is for instance automatic calculations of bottom hole pressures. So you have production data, you have your artificial lift and wellbore data. You marry that with some integration of choice, and it results in that you can basically compute bottom hole pressures on every single day for every single well. So when you open the tool, you have production data for every single well, updated until today. You have bottom hole pressures updated until today on every single well. And it sounds like a big thing to do, but like we have multiple of the clients here today, and we've been able to set this up in like less than a week on all the wells that they have internally. So if you want to make it quick, it's very, very easy to make it quick. In general, we've also, as I mentioned, tried to focus on like getting the new technologies into the tool. But probably most importantly, from here and going forward, our goal is to have like the best support in the industry. That's very, very important for us. And on average, our response time to support tickets is less than 2 minutes. And obviously, if it's like a feature request and stuff, we can't always get back in 2 minutes with a new feature. But like being responsive, letting you know that we're here to help you guys with whatever it is, to use the tool, talk about, just brainstorm about different items that you're observing with your data and stuff, is something that we take extremely seriously. And that everybody on the team, whether they're developers, whether they are people more on the technical side, etc., we share this joy about like really working tightly together with or the users. And that's the only way we've been able to get the tool so quickly in less than 2 years and in that direction. So there is a release this week. There's a bunch of new things there, but I'll focus on some of the main things. Stian will have a presentation on one of them. The biggest thing that has been requested by all of you, and I'm so glad that it has come in this release, and it's really related to saving cases. So if you're doing any type of modeling on the physical front, let's say a numerical model, numerical RTA run, multi-phase flow material balance, maybe a bottom hole pressure run, you can now go in as a layer under the well view here, where you can go in and create a sensitivity. And what that means is that you're not creating a new well, you're just creating a sensitivity under the well layer, and all of them, you can see all the sensitivities that you run. You can see under the well level. You see who created it, when it was created, etc. And you can even privatize it or make it company-wide as you like. So let's say Rohit and I are working on the same well. He can make different sensitivities on a well that only he sees, and I can make my sensitivities on the same well that only I see, and I can choose to share it with the people that I want in the organization. This goes for all the numerical versions of the tool, and we hope to get it into the last release, but doing this very properly, as I think we've done now, has required like a lot of thought internally, and it's a really, it might seem simple, but it's so many things in the background there that needs to happen at the same time. So we're really proud of it, and I know just for my own sake, I'll probably save 10 years of my life just on this one feature alone. Okay, so this is big, and I would probably look at least 15 people in this room that have requested this feature, so that's a good thing. The second thing is that we have a starting point now for our GIS system in the tool. The way to get there, if you're anywhere in the tool, is just click this icon up here. And for starters, it's just the well locations that we have that you can upload, both surface and bottom hole. You can measure both the distances of between 2 points, or you can also create like areas if you like to do that as well. And then the other thing for starters is the opportunity to group wells, and that's primarily for like type well type of workflows. And you can create like an own type well project where you go in and do that type of work. So here we actually we want to just release it as quick as possible and just get a lot of feedback. My friend Stephen Young here is very good at like getting lists of like just trashing on the software, and we just make sure that we implement and make it better, and then everybody's happy in the end of the day. And that's what I hope for you guys as well. We have emotions towards the product, but the more honest it is, the better it is for us, because then we can just improve upon it. That's the only thing we're here for. So that's going to be good. I know Jason here on the second row, he'll hopefully have a lot of good feedback there in terms of making the GIS better as well. But that's key for a lot of things. Also being able to map PVT properties, everything from LFP and contacted pore volumes, etc., across the place, even petrophysical data. So that's going to come in here. The second thing is being able to tune. This has also been a feature I've been requested by probably 10 people, at least in this room, and a lot of others. So let's say you have gauge data on a pad for one well, and then you don't have it on all the other wells. So what you can do is that you can take one of the wells with gauge data, and you can tune all the correlations to that gauge data, and you get basically two coefficients. Stian will talk about them. One is related to gravity, right, Stian, or liquid holdup, and one is related to friction. Yeah, exactly. And then these tuned parameters are then what you're using, or you can choose to use them on these other wells where you don't have gauge data. Okay, and I think a lot of people have seen something similar in Prosper, for instance. And you can do it on all the different correlations, and here you just see the difference between the two. So that's also a huge thing there. Even though I know a lot of you have done more like field-wide studies of bottom pressure and comparing like which correlations is doing better and whatnot, and a lot of the studies that we've done, at least with this group, yielded pretty good results. The last thing is so one of the most popular features in the tool is like when you calculate your bottom pressures, you're able to smooth the bottom pressures graphically, and you don't have to do that in Excel and stuff, and that's a big time saver. And based on requests from Stephen Young and others, being able to do that on every single time series data that we have in a tool is something we're now allowing for. So, and why is that important? Well, it's important because many times we're dealing with allocation issues, etc., in the production data that we have. So you can say that parts of the data I would like to smooth, maybe parts of the data I would like to shift up because of this was an obvious allocation issue. Maybe the tubing pressure is obviously. Maybe there's some outliers here that doesn't make sense. Maybe I like to ignore them. I can do that very easily. And then you can choose whether you would like to use the raw data, or whether you would like to go in and actually use the smoothed version of the data. So that's also coming in the release. And I got a note from Marcus, our CTO on the software side there. He said that we're releasing it for everyone tomorrow. And this can be parts of the data, several parts of the data, etc., but extremely powerful to do that on all the time series data, just in the interface itself. And because a lot of people have done that like in Excel and stuff and then moved it back in, and it's really, really time consuming. The last part is like, okay, what's next on the whitStream side of things? So what's coming, like what we're working on now that will come in the next, hopefully next few months there, So of course a big upgrade. This was a starting point for the GIS, but we like to be able to upload shape files, etc. in the tool. So there's a big GIS upgrade coming. Multi-well numerical models has been a big thing from a lot of companies. So getting that into the tool is huge. We're getting in that's in the end of the month. Getting in like a CPG workflow if you want to just more for well interference stuff. There we were just actually waiting for a company that like did it not as a project, but they had like a design project they would like to use it for. So that's what we're doing there, and that's going to be a part of the analytical RTA tab. So you'll have classical RTA, fractional RTA, and CPG, and it's going to be just drag and drop and everything. So that'll be nice. There'll also be a very, very large upgrade of the typo and DCA functionality, and we're working with many of you to just make sure that that's very seamless, and also that we can very easily export and import into areas, etc. And then this numerical version of fractional RTA will come into the tool as well. Lastly, I'm also super excited about that we're launching. And we'll talk more about this, but like in unconventionals, there's not really need for a lot of equation of state models. We typically use a basin-wide or a field-wide equation of state model for a field. But of course, there's software is used to create those equations of state. And this is probably more relevant for a conventional audience, I guess, but it's still relevant to mention since there's some of you that have conventional assets. So in Q1 of next year, we're launching something called whitSun PVT. It's a whole separate product. So it's really not necessarily that relevant for all whitSun PVT users, but it's basically a competitor to PVT Sim. So we'll have fluid data management. So instead of uploading wells and stuff, you're uploading samples and lab data and that kind of stuff. And then you can create field-wide equation of state models in that tool, and obviously very easily export or import those into whitSun Plus if you'd like to do that. Marcus will mention a few more things on that later. And I think that is probably that. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
If the whitSun have any intention to do a similar GIP for defect test, reservoir pressure across multiple competitors? So
like on defects, you said? No, but if people want to do it, no, we haven't thought about that. No, I know there's some. You've been involved in some of the defect consortiums as well. So maybe Craig and you was at least one in the Bakken, right? That.
Early on, ResFrac did a defect JIP.
Yep.
And so it was more to advance the analysis than it was to develop analysis tools.
Yeah.
And that's been published. You
can
pick up the paper from by Mark McClure, the principal author.
Yeah. So if there's a big interest on that, like initial reservoir pressure is a big uncertainty, right? Initial reservoir pressure and also flowing bottom pressures, those two things, super important when you do RTA. Like if those are off, then you're kind of a little bit screwed already. But that's maybe something we can look into if there's any interest on that front. I don't know if a lot of people have, like Eric, do you have like a lot of defect data in SM?
Yeah, we have a ton. Andrew's been doing a bunch of work on that.
Andrew, I knew Andrew. Is he doing all your work now?
Pretty much. All the good work.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Anything else?
As part of the consortium, you guys wanted to look at about 10 wells or so on a per company basis. How are you going to handle that?
In the consortium, or yeah. So in the follow-up consortium, like so in this consortium, like pretty much all the companies have done way more than 10 wells. So in the next follow-up consortium, we basically just said, okay, these are the R&D items. You have access to the software, and we're basically providing the same support as now. So if you want to do 10 wells, if you want to do 100 wells, if you want to do, some of you guys have done thousands of wells literally in the tool, we're not going to stop you. So there's no limit on that. We're just there to help if you want to do that work. That's how we're handling it. Very good.
So any new thing on the whitSun PVT, or it's just
I'm sure.
And bring it.
Yeah, so I'm sure the whitSun PVT folks. So Marcus Hayes and Henrik, they're leading or spearheading that initiative. I saw some demos last week, and I was or 2 weeks ago. I was really, really impressed. So it looks very good. We'll launch that for ATCE next week. So just come. I'm sure they'll be happy to show you a demo now, but you can also come to the booth and see the first step there. In terms of equations of state that we'll support initially is the Peng-Robinson SRK. So it's going to be, that is the focus initially, but it's going to be much more of a focus on the fluid data management side of things, because a lot of the tools are more like, okay, you can do US work, but where is all the data stored? It's just stored in Excel sheets and Microsoft folders. So it's big focus on fluid management, and then the US work is a part of that.
Are you thinking of putting something related to flow assurance type of?
Yeah. So flow assurance related calculations will be there. So hydrate models, asphaltene models, etc. Eventually will come in there. So it's going to be full kind of competitor to PVT sim there. So that's going to be a big focus. And then we have on a lot of that stuff, like John Ratalovsky, that was he was with Schlumberger. So the presenter just repeats the question before answering. That would be great. Next up is Marcus. The reason why we have this presentation is that everybody that uses Whitson Plus, they do a lot of thermodynamic equation of state calculations by very simple means. And our biggest message with this presentation is that it's not magic or a black box or anything like that. It's based on a very rigorous process that has been developed, with probably Curtis Whitson in the front row of that the last 40 years. And it's only built upon physics, mathematics, thermodynamics, etc. And Marcus will just run you through how you can quickly get a good understanding of how that work is done. So with that, Marcus, take it away.
Good. Yeah. No. So it's don't worry, you're not going to have to do any thermodynamics here today. And I just like to mention, I mentioned to Braden already. Like, this is the time, if you're not interested, to go sneak out and get a drink early if you're that type of person. There's a song, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Actually, the people in Norway, it's 5 o'clock now, so they're probably having a couple of drinks already, so that's fine. I want this to be kind of a practical guide, so you can see the workflow that I have to work through to develop the field-wide US models, or basin-wide US models that you guys can just use and enjoy. And if you want any of the real details, this is the paper I would go look at. Let us know. You can we can send the link. So it's my colleague Bilal and et al. Always makes the best papers. So that's the go read paper. Okay. So the first question you want to ask is, what is an equation of state? And it's really just an equation that relates pressure, volume, and temperature, or PVT, as we like to say, as well as the compositions for your fluids. And what I'm going to show you down here is just a little bit of a timeline of like the history of the equations of states. I think everybody here is familiar with the ideal gas law. You might remember it from your like high school chemistry. That's kind of the first real equation of state for ideal gases. Then van der Waals came a little bit later, made a little bit more complicated equation that actually did more accurate predictions. And this was the first cubic equation of state. So if you ever heard that term, he's the guy to blame. And for most engineering purposes, that's still what we use today. It's more or less exactly the same function as van der Waals, just a little bit more complicated, but we're not going to go into the details there. So as I've already mentioned, an equation of state, you can just think of it as like a black box that you give it a pressure, you give it a temperature, and you give it a composition. And if you have a good thermodynamic engine, it'll spit out, your results, and you'll be happy with that, and you don't have to think about it anymore. Now, if you are interested, I'm sorry, but basically it's just a set of choice of an equation. So you can choose Peng-Robinson or SRK or whatever model you want. Then it's going to be two sets of tables, and that's what we provide in Whitson Plus and everything else. The first one is the component properties. That's just describing each individual component. And the second one is the set of parameters, which are the binary interaction parameters. We don't need to go into that. I did my whole thesis on it, and I still don't know how they work. So, one important thing to note here is that the C7 plus properties, so starting from your C7 here all the way down, these are always unknown. They're not in some table. You don't know what they are. So these need to be found, and they need to be approximated, and that's what most of what we do when we do EOS model development. Okay. So just to set the stage, just imagine. I know most of you guys are unconventional folks, but just imagine we have something like this. We have a system where we have two reservoirs here. One which is an undersaturated saturated reservoir with a gas at the top and oil at the bottom. Second one being like a gas condensate reservoir nearby. And way back, maybe in the 80s or something, you drill a vertical well like that, and you maybe only want to produce from the gas cap, for example. Then a couple of years later, you see you have this gas condensate, you want to drill through that, and then you commingle those two fluids into a manifold. And you produce those to a platform like this, right? And at this point, you don't really know what's happening, the flow and all that stuff. So maybe you want to add a multi-phase flow meter down here. Then after a while, your boss asks you, why aren't you producing from this oil here, right? So somebody made a stupid mistake. So what you go, you drill a couple of wells, and you're in that zone. You take that fluid, put it on a boat, you shoot it onto the onshore facility, and there you have the kind of like the full system of a typical kind of conventional thing. Now, basically, the first thing that's going to happen is that you're going to need an equation of state for this part. And then that gas condensate, that's going to need a separate equation of state. Then you have your topside facility. Oh, sorry. This reservoir as well is going to have another equation of state. Your topside facility is going to have a fourth equation of state. And the multi-phase flow meter actually needs a very specific, like it'll say in the specifications, 10 components, blah, blah, blah. And none of the other equations of state work for that. So you need one for that. And it gets even worse when you look at the transport equations. You need, volumetric properties for all of those. And that's typically black hole tables or tubing tables. And all of those are functions of the equation of state that you use. So you're going to have different black hole tables, tubing tables for all your different pipes. And then the topside folks, the surface facility folks, they're very picky with their components. So like they want their BTEX components, and that's very important. So you end up with a lot of fluid models, and that's fine. That's just kind of reality. But the real problem here is that if this is done in the historical kind of manner, then these are not going to be internally consistent. So the PSAT, or the saturation pressure for EOS-A here, is not going to give you the same result as EOS-D or F or any of the other ones. And that's an issue. So that's why we kind of want to create a common field model. Now, for the unconventional space, it's a little bit different. What you could imagine is that you have a bunch of wells like this, and only a few of these wells that you have PVT data and compositional data, right? And maybe you're lucky, you have a couple of extra wells that only have compositional data, but the rest of them only have GORs. And if you want to do any PVT calculations or any of the things that are really important in Whitson Plus that need PVT, if you have a field-wide EOS model, it's like if all of these had compositions and PVT experiments. Because with the JIPs that we've had, we've been able to make these basin-wide EOS models, and they're able to give you both compositions and also do all the calculations that the EOS model needs to do, generate the black hole tables and all that stuff. And this is kind of a snippet kind of showing where Matthias is taking one of these Tech Tip Tuesday videos and picking a GOR here. And just to show you, whenever you pick that GOR for that well, that's all the data you have, you get a bunch of extra information from your equation of state. You can get the phase envelope, looks nice, you can send it to your boss, and maybe get a promotion or something. Okay, so how do we know if we can create a field-wide EOS model? Okay, it's a big question. The first thing is kind of the geoscience of it. And the question we ask is typically like, are the reservoirs or are the formations near each other? Now, this is not a requirement for having a common EOS model. You could be lucky and have a reservoir here in Houston, like, in Texas, and one in Norway have the same EOS model, but that's just by luck. Second thing is the characterization. And we typically ask, do the C7 plus properties have some commonality? That's kind of what that means. But it really comes down to the predictions, right? If we're able to have one EOS model that can predict all your PVT experiments, that's the real test. So we always start with an initial set of predictions with our characterized EOS. Now, these are not going to be accurate, but we want to look for certain things to make sure that they're consistent. And then the real test, and the only one that's required, that's this last one. Can my equation of state predict all my PVT data? Okay, if there's not big errors in it or like contamination. We're just going to assume that the first one is okay. And I'll take you through 3 plots that we usually make when we look at the characterization. The first one is for each sample, we plot something called the Watson characterization factor. Now, you don't need to know what that is. You don't even need to think about the left axis at all. just look on the right side. Okay? If it's high up, it's more paraffinic. If it's further down, it's more aromatic. Okay? And if those terms don't mean anything, that's fine as well. It just means a little bit lower down is heavier and higher up is lighter. That's all you need to know. Okay, so for reservoir A, we plot all the samples. That the numbers, they fall in line here. Pretty good trend. For reservoir B, same thing except for this guy. Now we have an outlier. That's nice. Maybe a little bit the second to last one as well. We'll come back to that. And then for reservoir C, you see the two first, they're kind of dipping down below, more aromatic, and then the last three are okay. Now, to give you a reference, what every lab will give you and what most PVT softwares will give you is a value up here by default. Okay? So for this case, we're actually, if we just use the lab composition, molar composition, we're going to be predicting a more paraffinic fluid than what we actually have, a lighter fluid. Okay, so they're kind of screwing you already there. And what we have is a slightly more aromatic one. The second plot that we look at is the specific gravity or density for each component versus molecular weight. So now we're going to plot just the C7 plus molecular weight specific gravities for each sample. The first reservoir is up here. The second reservoir is up here. And you see the slight deviation. That's the same sample that had a deviation before. And then the third one is here. Okay, the third reservoir is here. And we can see from these two samples, that's most likely condensate from a gas condensate sample. Okay, and that's why they were deviating in the first plot. Now, this gray line, that's what the lab and most PVT softwares will tell you is the relationship between the specific gravity and molecular weight. Why should you care? You're going to be under-predicting your densities if you put this into your equation of state model. And that everybody cares about. You know, your flash oil densities, everybody cares about. So you might also have some Betex components, but that's not that important. So we want a model that looks like this, and that's what we do. And in Wisdom PVT, we'll do that as well. Okay? The last plot is when you take the compositions. We want to plot the compositions of just the C7 plus components. And then we're going to normalize it. And if you do that, something really interesting will happen. The first reservoir, all the compositions will fall on top of each other. There will be some scatter, but more or less follow the same trend. Now you see you have this signature where it kind of like they all dip and they come back up again. That's not usually bad data, especially not if 200 samples have it. If the labs from different labs predict the same bad data, then it's more likely good data, but an actual trend. So for reservoir B, you get the same thing for the first sample. This next sample you see, it starts dipping down about C25. This is indicating bad data. Okay, and this is a very common signature. You need to think about why. And for the conventional folks, this is typically what you see if you have mud contamination. Well, I guess that's also not relevant here. And yep, reservoir C, you have this, and here are your gas condensate samples. They're going to not follow the same trend. That's just because they don't have the same amount of C7 plus components. Okay, so our characterization looks good. Seems like all the fluids can be described from the same EUS model. The next thing we have to do then is the initial predictions. So we take this characterization information, we create an equation of state that honors this data, and I want to give a shout out to this quote by Richard Feynman. First thing you do is you guess, right? And then your guess here is your characterized EUS predictions. And then you want to compare it with what you actually see in reality, which is the PVT experiments. And sometimes, as much as we like to make common EUS models, you can't do it. And that's fine. But you don't know until you've actually tried. Okay, so you have to predict. You see, compare with the consequences. So one of the things we typically look at for each sample is the saturation pressure deviation. Okay, and so for the first reservoir, they're all over predicted 1 to 2%. Reservoir B, all but that one sample are over predicted by the same kind of amount. And the last one as well, they're all over predicted. Now you might say, well, you know, Whitson, you guys are doing a bad job. You're all over predicting the saturation pressures by 2%. That's not good enough. Well, this is a really good sign because we know that we can take all of these saturation pressures and consistently shift them down by using the BIPs or scaling on the BIPs. So that's actually a really good sign. It would be much worse if I had over prediction and under prediction. Now, from the characterization, you get for free, more or less, that the liquid densities are very accurately predicted. You see, they're all within 0.5%. And that's what you would expect, except for this one sample, which has mud contamination. So all that hard work you do as prep in the characterization, trying to describe those C7 plus components, you get the reward here, and also from the saturation pressure. That's looking good. The last step is the tuning. Now, our motto is to tune as little as possible, or at least to tune things that we know are not going to mess things up thermodynamically. So we have a set here. There's a bunch of things you can do. This is just some that I recommend. The BIP scaling, now that's not going willy-nilly on the BIPs, but just scaling them up and down. That'll affect your saturation pressure estimates. Recombination regression, that's really important if you have like, you can get better density predictions. That's all you need to know. And then the component properties, we want to change them in such a way that we don't get big jumps or funky things happening in the calculations. And an important thing to note here is that as their components get heavier and heavier, the properties that they have become more and more uncertain. So we want to reflect that in our EOS model tuning. So the C7 component shouldn't deviate a huge amount, but the C36 component, C36 plus component, that has a big uncertainty, so we can change that more. So if we have something like this after the tuning, saturation pressures are all nicely predicted. That's good. And all the densities, now they're going to have an even tighter fit. Those should be predicted more or less perfectly. This is kind of what the real test is, if we can have a field-wide EOS model or a basin-wide EOS model, except and then also all the experiments. Okay, that's good. So if we go back here, and I promise we're getting close to the end now. This is what we had, right? We had all these different fluid models. And the question is, how can I make them consistent so that they all predict the same thing or give me the same result? Okay, they have all different component slates or number of components and this and that. And the solution that we use is basically we make a parent EOS model. That's the one we develop when you do the tuning. And it is very detailed. It has a bunch of components, and it's not going to be like if you put it in your reservoir simulator, it's going to take 100 years to run. You use that model to create your child models. So A and F, for example. And you pick those components, like those EOS models, so that they predict the same thing. And you do the same thing for EOSD, and you do the same thing for all the other ones. And what you end up with then is something like this, where you have one parent EOS model, which has created all of your child fluid models. And the benefit of this is that they're all going to be internally consistent. Okay? And I can talk for about this EOS modeling forever, but the proof is in the pudding, right? So these are, I think, most of the basins that we've developed like basin-wide EOS models for in the United States. And then here you have in Canada. We also have in South America and in Saudi. Okay, so it's not just an academic concept that we'd like to talk about. It's actually something that we do every day at whitCon. So then the question is, well, how can you create a field-wide EOS model? And I'm just going to insert a shameless plug here, and that's the software that we're working on now, which will be hopefully commercially available in Q1, or will be commercially available in Q1 in 2023. And what do we do in whitCon PVT? Data management, which is a huge pain in the butt if you deal with a lot of PVT reports and all that stuff. Model development, and you can just seamlessly input that into the model utilization in the tool like whitCon Plus. And if you're in Houston next week, make sure to check us out at 8 to C. Okay, I hope, we have a little bit of time. Good. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question next with this. Any cases
for the unconventionals? Okay, so the question was, were there any basins in the unconventional space that we were not able to create a common EOS model for? And the answer is no. Basically no. So yeah. So when it comes to data, we've had these JIPs where a lot of you guys are part of it, and that really helps. The more data, the better, really. And yeah.
there are a few examples in conventional.
Yeah, definitely in the conventional space, it can be different. Yeah, because then you might have migration and all commingling of different source rocks and all this stuff. So, biodegradation.
This is regarding the first part of the equation state model. You develop a equation model that can be applied throughout the chain of this whole fluid. The temperature is constantly changing from subsurface all the way to the facilities and even beyond pipeline and stuff like that. But some of this equational state is very big in temperature reflection, how the temperature. Do you plan to do something to make up for that, or is it just play with the other parameters?
So just to repeat the question is basically how are we thinking about handling the temperature dependence of the equation system? And that is a big issue. Now, there are many ways to solve that, and we're really looking forward to the challenge of trying to automate that in a software. One thing that has worked really well for us with the consultancy project that we've had has been literally just to have almost the exact same equation of state, but some things slightly different for the surface EOS and the reservoir EOS. And what those some things might be, the things that are typically temperature dependent, that's the volume shift and the BIPs. The rest will be the same. So that would basically be, you would have two equations of state that have the same character, but they would have slightly different, yeah.
In the past, we have approached that problem exactly the way you described it.
Yeah.
But temperatures are not the issue, but we have some idea of how to handle that. Maybe I'll talk to you after.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk afterwards. Yeah. Throw some darts and stuff. That'll be good. Yeah. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Rashid Suhail, and I'm from Calgary, looking after marketing. I have a question about the tuning of the equation of state. So we just recently had some experience doing that. So my question is, if you have a multi-well or basin-wide equation of state, and we have like more PBT studies. So what I've seen that instead of tuning the equation of a state, we go after looking QC the PBT studies and then adjust the compositions so that it matches the basin-wide equation of state. So my question is, what conditions are we looking at? What in the PBT study, so that like we believe that it's we don't need to actually tune equation of state, but look for things to correct in the PBT studies, especially the compositions.
Yeah. So I guess everybody heard that, so we don't need to repeat it. But yeah, that is definitely the case. There is always going to be measurement error in the lab. That's just a fact, right? It's either going to be a big deviation or a small deviation. And the thing you mentioned with the composition is always going to be uncertain. And if you give us a sample and ask us to predict it with the already existing field-wide EOS model, then we will do like a regression on the composition, or we will change the composition very slightly and in a consistent way with what the lab measurement errors would reflect, to see if we're able to get it to be predicted with the common EOS model. And the reason for that is because if you have 200, 300 samples with PBT data that all give you a good match with one common EOS model, and then you get a new sample coming in, which is just like right in the middle of all the other ones, what do you believe is most probable, right? That sample is completely different from all the other ones around it, or that it's just a measurement in the error. That's kind of the philosophy there. But we will do slight compositional adjustments, yes. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, that's the answer I got in the beginning. So thanks for.
Good. Okay, I think that's it.
Let's do a 15-minute break here.
Perfect.
And then we'll be back 15 past. you mention that to the people on the call?
Yeah, so 15 minutes. What was it? 10 past? 5 past? 5 past? 15 past, I mean, yeah. Good.
One of the things we tried, yeah, this is exactly the, in Exxon, and I was there, I defined this parent model and then go through all this
Yep.
different things, but still we have this problem with the temperatures. The way I didn't complete it. We are thought of doing it is try to take the A and B, whatever parameters, because they're all temperature dependent. That's where the weakness comes. So there is
Yeah, I don't know, like you mean the omega A and omega B?
no.
Or just the, like
B,
the alpha
C, D,
term?
Yeah,
Oh,
all
yeah.
other terms. So you take the mixture of A and then create a subsurface condition, what the A looks
Yeah.
like. Then move it to other conditions and generate them. And then when you can generate a temperature dependency of A, B, and C parameters. So that way, the way PVTSIM does, they just give you another coefficient. It's not, it creates a lot of issues.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. No, I mean, we haven't really seen that as much. I mean, and I think part of that is because our consultancy usually stops at the top site. Like we don't communicate with them that much, and that's an issue. And I really think that when we
Because I tried in lumping.
Yeah.
Same approach.
Yeah.
The mixture of parameters, when you go different number of components, they have to force fit.
But on the lumping, we are the only people in the world who do global search of all the possible lumping schemes. And not only that, but we use face comp. So we make sure that the A is exactly the same. The A and the B are exactly the same
In all
in
models.
the detailed US and in the lumped US. For not just one temperature, for all temperatures. And that's an unpublished method that Aaron made. So that's something to think about as well.
Similar approach on the applying the equational state for various.
Because in PBT sim, this is interesting, if you take the same equation of state and you lump it, your single phase densities, which should always be 100% the same, they can be up to 10, 15, 20% different just by changing the component state. And that is incredibly bad. Like it's a really bad sign. And yeah, I'm looking forward to. Do you have a question?
Yes. Well, coming. Okay.
Just want to make sure, the deadline for that also.
You guys
Yeah.
have created a great state for all unconventional,
Okay.
right, in North America. I'm just curious about the vision and applicability of this new software. Where do you think it's going to be applicable? Are you more
For which
focused-
PVT, you mean?
For which
Yeah.
PVT,
So that's more going to be relevant for the conventionals. And the reason for that is because for the unconventionals, we have field based on YDUS models already for all the bases. I mean, there's not really more to do. But for the conventionals, we get projects every year. Small reservoir here, small reservoir there. And just like dealing with 10, 20, maybe 30 samples on some of these smaller reservoirs, it's really hard in PVT sim. And what we want to do is we want to create like a workflow that is easy and like instead of having to call us and pay us more money than we really need to do it in the month, I want you to be able to do it in a week by yourself on like which that's the goal, right? And we're really close to getting something that's I think.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure that
Yeah.
I was not missing something in terms of applicability in the unconventional.
Yeah. So I think for the unconventionals in the US as well, there are applications, but I think that would be more like which is DVT like. Because like if you get a new sample and you want to validate the US that you currently have, you can send it to us and we'll do it. That's fine. I mean.
But the thing is, why would you get a new sample when you already have 200 samples, right? Right.
It happens. We have projects every single year, almost every single month, where it's like, yeah, we got 10 new samples we want to validate, or somebody wants to opt into the GIP, that workflow, it is tedious to do in most PVT, or in all the PVT software. And we want that to just be really simple, really simple. But also just knowing what data you have. Knowing what data you have. If you have 100 PVT reports with PVT experiments, and they're just sitting in somebody's folder, you paid a lot of money for it, so why not at least know that you have it?
Yeah, I'm just curious to see the data space management aspect. We do still have a lot of PVT reports, but it's more conventional.
What?
We still have a lot of PVT reports from our conventional fields, right?
Yeah.
We still have a lot that aren't, obviously, the JIP participated in. There's a number of samples that have been included, and we have a number that haven't been as well. So, I don't know the best way, or I don't know. Yeah, the store, and also just like kind of validate them against the EOS as well, other than just saying, hey, this is what makes sense. And truly, they all do.
And I mean, that might even be just like a very simple extension where you go from plus. You have a couple of extra samples, and let's just say you want those to be put in as compositions for well. Like if you have a different performance plate than you have in your EOS, have you ever tried to compare it? Like go from a lab plate to an EOS plate manually, like especially if it's a C7 plus or like a C10 plus, older sample, you stop at C10 plus. How do you do that in Excel? You have to code up the gamma models, and you have to split the C7 plus.
The one thing that constantly deal with the surface side of things, right? You will constantly get questions from marketing guys. What do you expect the gas composition to be for this well that's coming
Exactly,
on,
yeah.
right?
And
we'll spit out a report from Wix and Plus as of right now, give it to them, but I don't think that that's anywhere close to what they actually see in the field, right?
And there, we have done technology for converting from volumetric rates to compositions. That's technology that was developed around 2010. It's called VOC, like so black oil decomposition. And if you have a field by US model, you can get very accurate estimates of those compositions. So if you want for like allocation reasons, topside reasons, to know the gas composition, even with BTX components, like that is technology that we have in-house and we can do as consultants, and we want to share that technology with everybody. That's kind of
Are you going to do like once? I guess it's not going to come out until Q1 next year, right?
So we're demoing it on an HT.
Are you going to have like a presentation that you're going to give on the software?
Yeah, I mean.
But I'm not planning to come to the APC. Just
no, so we actually have a technical committee for the Wikipedia software, and where we once a quarter have like we're going to be showing like going forward now it's just going to be demos of new features. But I also planning like have questions like things that you want, like the conversion from volumetric rates to topside. That type of thing is perfect information for us. But if you're interested, we can show you set up a separate demo.
I'm curious, I have a probably not really EOS. Maybe I'm not thinking about this right, but is there a way for me to like? I know it's common EOS, it's good. Yeah, it's like something called it's good. Like, is it really? Is there a way to like combine like better information with this information, or is it like having common EOS the same level of like precision? Okay, lumping all that together versus all.
So the more samples you have, the more trust you have in the that's very important. Like, if your QR range is like here, and you get a sample, like between your US model, that's QR range. And you get a sample that's inside that range, I wouldn't be afraid of like fluctuating. If it was like a formation or like formation vectorization EOS, or if it was however, where the field by US model is, you have this UR range, and then you're going to extrapolate a little bit higher UR, a little bit lower UR. If you made a field-wide US model, the certainty that you have in that region is much higher. But even inside the UR, the more data that you have, it shouldn't be worse than if you lose. That's kind of right.
Yeah, fair.
It's like, why do you want to?
I guess, yeah, that was that's the way to ask the question. Is if I made one, it would be same answer as if I made
That's what we. I mean, if it wasn't predicted accurately for one of the information, it wouldn't make. Then we would say, okay, it's not possible to do this. We'll split one and we'll make one for that. So like that happens much more commonly in the conventional space. Like sometimes you just have very different groups, and it's not easy, but we're not getting paid to make a common US model. Then we might have a split to make one for each, or slightly more than one. But for the unconventional, it hasn't been.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, if you're interested in a demo for the whitCon DVD, shoot me an email.
I'm not that knowledgeable to ask questions over PCP. I just wanted to have a general idea what the software is and what can you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Ja, Ika? Ja, oké. Kör det på droppet.
Så vi ska prova start igen. Hey boss, you ready?
I think so.
This is gonna be Shakespeare.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be so poetic.
I love it. Let's see here. I think should be all good.
So is it just the mic is here?
The mic is there.
Okay.
And then the only thing you do is like just stand here, and that should be it.
Okay, just use the arrow keys.
Mo or someone on the call. Okay. So here we go. I'll just ask some of these guys. Elena, are you able to hear me on Teams?
Yes, yes. Loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just mute that. Okay, so we'll get started. Continue with the program now. Next up is a very good friend, actually Oklahoma born, right?
Not born, but
Basically
at
Oklahoma
heart.
at heart, which is Curtis is from there. Marcus, his son, is also from there. We're kind of from there in some degree. But this presentation is about using RTA for designing artificial lift strategies. Very inspirational presentation title, to ESP or not to ESP? That's a question. So with that, just give you the floor.
Yeah, that title, you might think that I read a lot, but I don't. So we all learned how to make an equation of state, and we're going to come flying back down to earth. A little practical approach here, a lot less technically deep. I'm Brock Robertson, Marathon Oil Reservoir Engineer for the Permian Group. So just the premise is we get asked all the time, should we put an ESP in this well or gas lift? And what I mean by that is, should we put artificial lift that materially increases the drawdown more rapidly and enhances early life productivity, or should we put in an artificial lift or choose to operate our artificial lift more slowly such that we don't deplete the reservoir as quickly? The question behind that really is, or for the reservoir engineers to answer generally is the accelerated production associated with installing an ESP worth the cost? And it's a pretty nuanced question. There's more to that, like, are we damaging the reservoir if we draw the reservoir down too fast? I'm not getting into that per se, but what I wanted to do here was just use RTA as a medium to address this question of what does the acceleration profile look like? So what does the acceleration profile look like? A lot of times the easiest thing to do is say, let me take an example, or a sample set of ESP wells and a sample set of gas lift wells, and just compare them side by side and see which ones are better. Obviously the ESP is going to be better early, and you'll use that to say, here's the amount of acceleration. But it's a bit too simple, because if your ESP wells are better, are they interfering with the gas lift wells nearby? Is the rock the same? Is the completion the same? It ends up being a relatively complex problem. So RTA ends up being a reasonable solution, because you can use the same reservoir model, physics-based reservoir model, and iterate for what this might look like, make little changes to the model, and come up with a more robust and at least physically consistent answer to the question, what is the acceleration profile that you're expecting when you increase the drawdown? So the actual workflow here, I've got it numbered 1 through 6. History match a well. You can do this with one well. It works better with more wells, but pick a well that's on ESP, preferably. If you have a free-flowing profile before you have to put it on artificial lift, then match the well as best as you can. For the wells that we did here in the Delaware, we had to include a pressure-dependent permeability, and I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of ranges that we used at the end. But match one well on ESP, then simulate its production profile, then go back and delete the portion associated with the ESP, forecast what you think the drawdown would have done on your other artificial lift, or if you'd drawn it down more slowly, run that, and then compare your profiles, run economics, etc., to drive your decision. So step 1, history match the ESP well, the same frame that I'm sure all of you have seen many, many times. Step 2, forecast the production. So the key here, this production profile, decide something reasonable where you're going to go with your pressures, and record all of those rates. Step 3, copy that well, which I guess now we'll be able to do scenarios instead of having to copy the well, so that'll be nice. But delete out the production data associated with the ESP. Then come up with what you believe is a reasonable drawdown profile for that other artificial lift type. I'll show you later. I have an example where this particular well, I had an offset that was on the same pad and was on gas lift instead of ESP. So I had a nice analog to say, all right, here's what I expect the drawdown profile would have been like if we had used the alternate lift style. So delete the ESP data, pick your profile, your less aggressive drawdown profile. Forecast that out, record those. And then I didn't have a lot of memes when I figured out that process that I was going to have to go to actually show this. I had to delete all the memes. So, but I included that emoji up there. So I had to throw in a little bit for you. So then you end up with a profile that you can compare ESP versus gas lift, accelerated drawdown versus not accelerated drawdown, And that profile exists for all of time, and you can just throw that into your economic modeling program of choice and come up with whatever iteration sensitivity solutions that you want to present from there. So just some notes on the methodology. Obviously, it doesn't work if you don't have that free-flowing profile before and after to compare to. And then it's preferred that you have a geologically similar well nearby to confirm what you want your alternate profile to look like. And the more wells you have, the more robust your solution is. Obviously, each well can be sort of individual, and these answers are also non-unique. So getting a sense for the variability that you could have for the range of possible outcomes is easier to do when you have more wells to choose from and look at. Other notes for this exercise, I assumed that the SRV was constant. I didn't assume any like changes associated with pinching off of fractures that might happen. Just leaving all of that alone to give a simple analog for what a physics-based model would do in a different drawdown profile. And something to note, if you do a process similar to this, using downtime, your modeled rates obviously don't have any downtime, but your actual rates will have some downtime. So it's important to consider that and be thoughtful about what you assume for downtime in your simulated versus your actual data. So this is the example that I was talking about earlier. The red well is a gas lift well on the same pad as the dark blue well is the ESP well with their actual drawdown profiles. And the light blue in the background is the simulation or the bottom hole pressure profile that I plugged into this case. And this is my confirmation, since my light blue profile kind of overlaps really nicely with my actual gas lift well, it looks like a reasonable drawdown case of what that well would have done if we had not put it on ESP and instead put it on gas lift and drew it down more slowly. This is just a slide showing for this particular exercise, we did about a dozen wells in the Permian and ran multiple cases on several of them. But the more cases you do, the more variety of answers you get, the more you can start to understand what's happening. So this is showing sort of a high-level numbers removed version of the conclusion. The dark blue is a graph or a box and whiskers plot of the 1-year cumulative production data associated with this analysis. Again, this dozen wells. The 2-year cum and the 5-year cum for each of the wells that were simulated here. And actually, I guess let me step back. The y-axis is ESP percent outperformance versus gas lift. So your accelerated drawdown profile case, how much more oil did it produce than your slow drawdown case? And what we're actually looking at here is at 1 year, you accelerated a lot, your volumes were much higher than your slow drawdown case in your accelerated drawdown case. But by 5 years, they were significantly lower. They start to converge. And what this really does is it gives you an idea of when you accelerate production, the question is, where are you accelerating it from? If you're accelerating production from, say, the 40-year life of a well and bringing it forward into year 1, that's really meaningful. If you're accelerating production and you would have got it by year 2 anyway, all of a sudden that acceleration is not worth as much as if you're only accelerating it 1 year, unless you have like a really backwardated curve, I don't know, and you get $100 for that oil instead of 60 or whatever it ends up being. But given a profile, you can make assumptions like that and decide what management is willing to live with. And then my last slide is just showing a range of the pressure-dependent permeabilities that I used North Delaware for these primarily Wolfcamp Upper and Third Bone Springs. I used fracture gamma and matrix gamma, and the range of numbers that I could work, I used between 1 and 15 for fracture gamma, and matrix gamma between 0.1 and 5. So, and that number changed a lot of other numbers as well. So, like I said, non-unique solutions, and those do change. They can change the results of the the conclusions. So it is important to consider what you put there. But at least you have a model that is physics-based and history matched to what your well actually did in a fast drawdown scenario. And you can say what that model would have done in a different drawdown scenario. And that's all I have.
In that flow, you have the same gamma for ESP and gas lift?
Say that again?
In that flow, you have the same gamma factor for either ESP or gas lift?
Yes, yeah, so that was part of the, okay, the question is, on this plot, is it the same gamma for ESP and gas lift? And the answer to that question is yes. So the way that, again, in the process is, you model the ESP well, delete out the data. I guess I didn't even say this, but it's implied. Leave all the model parameters the same, and the only thing I change is the drawdown profile. So I figure out what gamma I need to match the ESP production, to history match the ESP production and pressure data, then delete out the ESP production and pressure data, leave the model exactly the same, and just change the drawdown profile to get a new production profile associated with the drawdown profile for the exact same model. Yeah. Yes.
For the terminal kind of flowing pressure you get down to, do you have it as the same for ESP and gas lift? Do you have the gas lift like not quite getting the same pressure?
So I made the simplifying assumption. The question is, for the for the terminal pressure, is it the same for ESP and gas lift, or is it different? And the answer is, I made the simplifying assumption that for most of these wells, we'll get to rod pump. So you're going to end up at the same place. So I left it the same. Generally, gas lift took long enough to get there that it was in a reasonable time frame. So let's say it took 5 to 8 years to get to the terminal flowing pressure anyway, which is a reasonable amount of time for us just based on the data that we've seen to expect to be on rod pump. So it does deviate from, I made a simplifying assumption to not go into detailed modeling for all of that, because primarily what I was concerned about is the first 3 years anyway, and the gas lift wasn't getting low enough that it required another artificial lift to get to that terminal pressure rate. So I didn't worry about modeling it precisely. Yes?
I think it's good that we have the pressure permeability on the factor analysis. Did you do the same thing for the relative permeability on the factor analysis? And the second question is, have you done or consider any calculation regarding the flowback as far as flowback versus passback in order to see whether your model in history match is actually reasonable to perform ESP versus gas lift, because it's all about drawdown, right? And that's going to be similar to what you do with the initial free flow between normal flowback versus passback.
Yeah, so 2 questions. One was, did I do something similar to this gamma for the relative permeabilities? And the answer to that is I left the relative permeabilities the same in the model for the ESP and the gas lift. Is that answering the question, or am I? Okay. So yes, the relative permeabilities I left alone as well. Using the exact same model, only difference is drawdown profile. And the second question was, remind me again?
ESP versus gas lift is primarily the drawdown, and then you use the initial free flow for the history match. And then you done some kind of modeling to verify or calculate the model if it can have some confidence whenever you do different type of flowback. For example, flowback versus fastback versus normal flowback, whether they're going to continue or have a pretty reasonable or good agreement in the history match data on oil, gas, water, and also.
Sure. So the question is, have I done any verification work that these models produce reasonable results by doing a slowback versus fastback on ESP or something like that? And the answer is not yet. So this is it's a relatively recent exercise and just layered on top of existing data to get an estimate for the production engineers this year that are trying to make a decision on a handful of wells. So no, we haven't done the detailed verification work yet, no. Yes?
Was there a clear economic victor between the ESP and the...
So the question is, was there a clear economic victor between the cases? And the answer is, For some, there was, and for others, there weren't. So Marathon's position in the basin is relatively scattered. We've got a lot of different pressure regimes. And there were cases where it was pretty clear you're accelerating not very much, and you probably shouldn't expect to put a large value on that accelerated component, or the amount you're accelerating is not accelerated very far in time. You're not accelerating it from year 40, you're accelerating it from year 2. So there were some obvious ones, but there were also some where it was less obvious and there was meaningful acceleration. And that's more of an economic question in, are you actually accelerating it into a higher price? Do you believe you can predict prices and all of the fun things that go along with that sort of side of the equation?
I'll ask one on behalf of our production engineers. Do you have a guess for how long would it be if it used IPRs and some ratio forecast on the same well? Traditional IPR process.
The question is, do I have a guess at how wrong it would be if you use the traditional IPR process to do the same thing? And the answer is no, I don't. I don't have a guess.
I think we have to wrap it up there. Then the next presenter is Stian. So I'll just go and make his presentation ready. Thanks, Brooke. Really, really good.
Super practical. Are people online able to still see the screen? I'll just test Elena again. She's on. It's like.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Excellent. So this we mentioned this. This is a new feature that comes out in the release that we're pushing tomorrow. So it's possible to tune basically these correlations we have in the software to measured gauge data. And then you can use those tuned coefficients on different wells. And that's what Stian process is gonna go through. Take it away, Stan.
Thanks. Yeah, so like Matthias said, tuning bottom hole pressures to gauge data. So this is something that several of you have asked for, and that's why it's been prioritized and we've developed it. What we're essentially doing is manipulating the traditional Hagedorn and Brown, Beggs and Brill, the correlations that you rely on to get bottom hole pressures, into or increase their predictability. But before I begin, just want to tell you who I am. So many of you have probably seen my name in emails and stuff, but because of COVID, I haven't been here to actually meet any one of you before now, and I'm glad I'm finally here. I work as a software engineer, mostly in whitCon. I take care of the BHP engine and the reservoir simulation engine. Those are the two main responsibilities. And I have an MS degree in petroleum engineering from NTNU. And hopefully soon, also a PhD, and these guys are now smiling because they wanted me to write the PhD there, but it hasn't been approved yet, so I'm not going to brag about it. But yeah, it's being reviewed right now. So. All right, so the new tuning logic in whitCon Plus, we've tried to make it simple for two reasons. One, sort of like starting complex never works, I think, and also to make it easier for you guys to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes here. So there are two tuning parameters. Like I think Matthias already mentioned this. There's one that acts as a multiplier, not directly on the liquid holdup, but almost. It corrects the liquid holdup, the sort of the key parameter of these correlations. That is the value that you average gas and liquid properties together such that we can use single phase flow calculations to compute pressure profiles in the well. So it's a very important number, and different correlations have different ways of coming up with it. And then there's the other one, which is has a varying sort of impact on wells and unconventionals, depends on how large the rate is the friction factor multiplier. But again, I would say most of the wells that we've seen in unconventional, at least I've looked at, is very often it's dominated by gravity. Pressure drop is dominated by gravity unless there's a very small tubing in the well, less than 2 inches in diameter. And then this guy here is gonna depend the most. And now you will see if when you start playing with this in the software that changing this value will have a significant effect on how the correlation will predict the bottom of pressure. And as with most tuning, the way it's done is that we just recompute the gauge, the pressure at the gauge, so you can specify any depth between wellhead and the top perforation, which is the reference depth for BHP. You can specify that, and we compute the pressure at that point in the well, and we try to match it to whatever's measured there from the gauge. And if no gauge depth is specified, then we assume top perforation. So we assume that the gauge is at where it's supposed to be. So just simply, how does it work? So standard well tubing, gauge at the end of the tubing, in this case, down to the perforated interval. The BHP in widths and plus is always reported at the top perforation. And for an untuned setup, so we always compute all the 4 correlations that we support. And the way it's done is that each bottom of pressure calculations is actually computing the pressure profile in the entire well. The only thing that you see are the numbers at the bottom here. That's what's interesting, right? All the other stuff is for those who have a special interest in sort of seeing the full thing. But you can see there's quite a bit of spread here. Like the gray one is probably underestimating here. I think this is an oil well, so gray is mostly gas. Beggs and Brill kind of tends to have a overestimation. And then the Hagedorn and Brown and the other one, which I never pronounce right, are always sort of on top of each other. So that's how it works. And how can we improve this? So if we only focus on the part of the well from the wellhead to the gauge, and we tune using those 2 parameters, the alpha and the beta, then ultimately what we want is all the 4 correlations to predict the same pressure at the gauge. Okay, so that's how it's changing that. So we start at the same pressure and we end up at the same pressure. So not surprisingly, the curves are very similar. And then once the correlation is tuned, we recompute the full length down to the reference to the top perforation. And now the spread is much less. And hopefully if you then, and now, depending on how, call it vertically different the gauge is compared to the reference depth, the spread in these correlations will widen if it's high up, and if it's close to the top perforation, if the tubing is all the way down to sort of past the kickoff point and into the lateral part, then it's essentially the same, right? There's no difference. So an example, I think Matthias already talked about what a use case could be for this kind of tuning is a situation like this, the 1 gauge 3 wells scenario. Could be more wells also, but let's say we have 3 wells from the same pad. They are completed the same. They have they start producing at the same time and have similar drawdown profiles, etc. But only one of them has a gauge installed. Then what you would like to do to just improve the correlations is to tune the correlations in that well, and then apply those tuned correlations to the 2 other wells. And I'm going to show an example here of some real data from the Scoop Stack, I think, where we have well A, the one with the gauge. Now, all these 3 wells have gauges in them, but for the sake of the argument, I'm going to assume that B and C doesn't, but to show how it improves. So this is the untuned prediction. I would say this is quite good already, but we can make it even better by tuning it. This is how it looks when it is tuned. Except for this part here, it follows on top of each other all the way, and the trend is sort of extrapolating out past the gauge data. So that's well A. Now, if we take the well or the tuning parameters from well A and we apply them to well B, which in this case this is the untuned, then it looks like this, applying those tuning parameters. It's not perfect, but it's close, and it's significantly better. And this is what you would have if you actually would have tuned into the data. So you see the gray and Beggs and Brill, they sort of struggle in the end here, whereas the Hagedorn and Brown and the BG is more on top. And also for well C, same thing here. This here is, I would almost argue it's no point in tuning, but still, this is the untuned well A data. Gray doesn't work very well here. This is an oil well, so it's to be expected that the gray is probably the worst one of them. That's with using the well A, and this is if you would have tuned it with, to the data present. But that's the idea. Then we're just going to show a GIF of how it looks. So it's just very simple. There's this button on the right here, up in the corner, that you click. You have the tuning menu, the two parameters for each correlation. You tune them. You have to tune them one each. No, you can't launch them all at the same time. And then what you see here is always the bottomal pressure, the one in the main plot. What you see if you click show fit is the pressure computed at the gauge. So if the gauge is not at the bottomal pressure depth, the correlations will be shifted relative to the measured data in this plot, but it will be on top in this plot. That's the idea. But if you don't specify gauge depth, then both plots will essentially show the same thing, except the fitting doesn't compute, it doesn't use all the pressures. It uses a selected set of pressures to fit the trend, to just make it run faster. Yeah, so that's it, mostly. I'm looking forward to hearing some feedback on this feature. It's one we're hoping to develop sort of together with you, especially those that you have requested it, but those who also already find this interesting. Looking forward to hear some feedback there. One thing I would like to just say before I open the room for questions is I wouldn't expect the correlations to become like magic just because you can tune them. Okay, it's a little bit back to what Marcus was arguing with the equation of state modeling, is that it's more important to filter out the bad data than it is to tune the model. Okay, so if you're gonna tune a bottom pressure correlation, make sure that you do a check or a recheck on, okay, how does the rates look? How does the measured data look? Are they consistent? Especially in the early times when sort of rates are not at all in there, it could be only water. Things that are may distort the tuning a little bit. So I think that's one thing. And also, I wouldn't tune the correlation to an ESP and then apply it to rod bump and expect to get perfect results. Okay, there are some things here that just won't add up fully. But for pads like the example I just shown, where you have 3 wells or 10 wells or whatever that have sort of like a similar history, they're all on, say, gas lift and then later all put on rod pump. The use case for this or the use of this could be quite good, I think. So, are there any questions? Far away.
Talking about in the flow of the well. If it is initially to a natural flow, you have the same tune application with a well that is operating under subject with some depth of application. And then I guess the second thing is you showed an example where there is potential parent well and there is child well. Are tuning going to be similar between these two? And are there any additional factors that you can factor in in order to make it a little bit more realistic with the reality? Just because you probably would start off at different initial pressure and then your depletion or decline would be a lot different than the parent well.
Yeah. So yeah, I just thought of a way to summarize it. So the question was just how will tuning apply over several wells, especially the parent-child well problem or scenario where there's different reservoir pressures for the 2 wells. And also is the same tuning parameters applied to the full history of the well. I'll answer the second first. At the moment, yes. So the 2 numbers that you get here, they're applied to the entire history of the well, regardless of what well configuration you have. So you can have multiple wall configurations. You can have first like casing flow, then put in a tubing, then put on some gas lifts, then put in the rod pump, natural sort of course of life for these wells. And the same tuning parameters apply. This is something that when we developed it, we were a little bit unsure how far we wanted to take it the first iteration. It was a discussion whether or not we would apply the tuning parameters per well configuration instead of for the whole one correlation for the entire life. We decided to start simple and then just see how it behaves. But from the testing, it seems like it works well. At least I think putting in an artificial lift, especially like rod pump, which is sort of like a complicated calculation procedure, affects it more. The parent-child scenario, I have to admit, I haven't looked that much at.
It shouldn't matter for this.
No.
It's like, this calculation is like 100% math flow from them to like from the heel to the top. It shouldn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So the comment was it shouldn't matter. I think that's true, but it's something that just has to be tested more.
Can you talk about what are we physically tuning with that beta parameter? Because that's
right.
Is it versus depth? What are we actually tuning?
Yeah. So I sort of wanted to stick to the philosophy of no equations, but yeah. Question was, what are we tuning with the beta parameter, the friction parameter? So the pressure gradient, the one that you're numerically integrating down the well, there are three things affecting pressure drop. There's gravity, there's friction, and there's acceleration. The third one you can just forget, never occurs except for gas wells at very low surface pressures. The two other ones matter. The friction there is a friction factor that you have to compute for the friction pressure drop. And the beta multiplier is just correcting that friction. It's just a multiplier on that F. So whether you use the Moody friction or the one that's a fourth of that, I can't remember what it's called, the fanning is it, I think. That's what it does. It's just a multiplier on the F. So it's correcting that, yeah.
Should I think of it like roughness?
No, it's not a roughness, because roughness goes more into the calculation of F. The sensitivity of roughness is probably much less than applying a multiplier directly on the F.
So just a question in terms of how would we practically implement this? Is this something you recommend, you kind of touched on this, recommend having, say, pipe routes or pad routes, say, all same tubing, casing side, all same formation that we're producing from, similar geographic area, and then you can say all of these are like for like. We had pressure gauge on one, we're confident in, therefore we apply it. Is that kind of the idea here, or is it? I guess I'm just wondering how granular can you be versus something more universal.
Right. So the question was, what's sort of our recommendation for how this should be applied? Well, the correlation, it's not like an equation of state. You can't apply it to a field and then expect it to be perfect. Yes, your summary of sort of it has to be within a smaller area, same pad. The wells have to have similar completions, behavior, etc. I think are a good starting point. I think if you start taking two wells that have very, very different production data and very different completions, the one's on gas lift, the other one's on rod pump, different things like that, I think you will have a harder time finding some parameter that fits both. Okay, so that would be my recommendation. Start with that, and then develop something that applies to sort of a smaller region or area. I don't know if there was any questions online, but
See any online,
okay. Well, thank you all.
Thanks, Dion. Great stuff.
Just a last comment on that. Many times, like, when it comes to like where we're going to apply the tuned correlations, many times like, okay, should you just use a default correlation that's untuned on a neighboring pad where you don't have a gauge? That's kind of the problem that you're in many times because you don't have the luxury of having gauges everywhere. Next presentation up is the last one before we take lunch. That's a presentation that actually been held in one of the previous knowledge sharing sessions. It's a presentation by Jason from Cord. Back then it was Whiting, but it's still super relevant, and it comes back to the use of the multi-phase flow material balance feature. So I'll just go and give you this now, Jason.
Cool. Yeah, so this was shown at the last meeting, but Matthias asked me to throw it out there again. And yeah, that was the last couple of days of Whiting there, so it still has the Whiting thing. I think it was over July 1 was the official date. So anyway, we'll be talking about using the material phase flowing material balance chain OIP estimates in the Bakken. So this was kind of the first set of wells that I had applied this to, and just gave a little presentation on it. The reason that I took a look at wanted to take a look at the flowing material balances because we had done a completion test in one of our assets, and so and that's where I applied this. And the completion, so this slide just gives a little summary of the completion test. So we have two DSUs, DSU A in blue, DSU B in red, and they're about a mile apart. In DSU A, we have 3 new wells, and they got what our base completion was at the time. And then again, DSU B, there's 2 wells, and they got basically a 40% uplift, so a 1.4 multiplier on what size completion DSU A got in both pounds per foot and barrels per foot. So both DSUs have a parent well, kind of a holding well. It's over a decade old. They were not didn't perform very well, having taken a lot of fluid off the DSU. And then all these wells target the Middle Bakken, the parents, the new ones, everything. So there's no Three Forks, so it's fairly straightforward. And test. Yeah, and that's it. So that's kind of what the starting point is for this. So after hearing, so this was kind of March of this year, and when Leslie and Barry were talking about this new flowing material balance, had some, reservations in Orion as well. But I thought this is going to be a great place to try this out. Again, fairly simple reservoir and fairly simple completion design. But what I thought really we had here was, very little depletion. So we think this is the phase diagram on the left. We're thinking reservoir pressure here is about 8,000 pounds. And so we have tons of headspace. And so we'll be just flowing, no gas coming out. It's just going to be oil and water for a long time. And so I thought this would be a great place to try this. And obviously undersaturated black oil. The other thing I had going for me in this experiment was typically the artificial lift method here is flow up a velocity string or a frac string, and then go to ESP. So that's kind of what I have on the graph. I guess I should use this. No, you can't see that. So on the left, I have the sand face pressures versus time for all these 5 new wells. So it's actually measured pressure from the velocity string. So we had strapped measured pressure on there, and then they all went to ESP, and luckily all the ESP pumps, pressure gauges continue to work. And so essentially have measured pressure for all these wells for their entire lives so far. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that, again, pad A had the base design, pad B had the uplift design, but not only did pad B have the uplift design, originally both of them were supposed to have 3 wells. Hadn't gotten the story straight exactly. Nobody can give me a straight story why pad B got 1 left, but the facilities were designed for 3 wells. And so not only did you have a bigger completion on the B, you also had bigger facilities, and all these wells produced more water than we were expecting. And so essentially pad A was constrained, pad B wasn't because it had 2 wells. And on top of that, also just wider spacing. So the deck was definitely stacked for B to be quite a bit better, especially just on flowing out of the well, which is, what we saw again. Pad A was constrained. You can kind of see that here. I didn't color code these, but the A ones are basically dead up here, where these 2 down here, they were flowing harder. Anyway, it was really good. The point being, it's really good to have pressure data, really good time to use RTA to try to normalize that difference in drawdown. And so again, this is the first time I've used the flowing material balance in whitSyn for these 5 wells, and I'm just showing an example of one here. But this table basically summarizes kind of what the flowing material balances that I use. I generally picked what I would call an aggressive slope. Again, I guess I did that for at least one reason, was that I was thinking this is going to be sort of the initial, it's initial, so probably the smallest. So go as much as aggressive as I can to sort of get what hopefully is the real contacted OIP. But I did that consistently across them. I picked as aggressive as I thought I could from the data. And then obviously, made sure that the reservoir pressure was above the flowing bottom hole pressure. So again, the blue ones are the ones that got the base frac, the 2 red ones, the ones that got the 40% larger frac. And essentially, actually if you average these, I think the blue is actually slightly bigger than the red. And so that was, a bit of a surprise, at least initially. But as we produce more, since this work, I guess we have about 6 more months of data. It's definitely played out that these have very similar contacted flowing material or contacted oil between these 2 completion sizes. And the other thing important, so at the time, whitSyn didn't have a multi-layer model. And again, we had quite a bit of water production, so I knew I needed multi-layer. And so I used these flowing material balance results to sort of give me the kind of first guess of what the XF for these wells were. So that was really handy as well, because it was kind of, before that, it was a little more guesswork. Still a little bit of guesswork, but this kind of gave me the starting point. So really felt good about the results I was getting, and just for the initial XF, I felt I had something to anchor to, if you will. So really impressed with, also like that there's no real perm in here. There's a number of things. Anyway, this was, again, my first attempt at this, and I've done probably 30 or 40 wells since then, and still feel really good about the results I get from these, given good data input. So conclusions are, again, I guess I just said it, but I get reasonable early time OIP. I guess I've done now, since then, I've done some wells with even longer histories. I don't really see the bend over again. I guess either a combination of we're on rods and our allocations get worse and worse, it seems, through time. But anyway, it's really handy in the Bakken. I think that I can get a pretty good, what I think is a pretty good contacted OIP early time. That's like a really, again, jump leap, I guess, in our understanding anyway. And again, I use those, I used it for the contacted OIP, and then I used those to estimate XF in a multi-layer simulation. Yeah, and then just the flowing material balance. As far as the completion test, we're seeing very similar contacted OIPs. And I like that the flowing material balance kind of accounted for the drawdown differences. Again, if you just looked at the cum of these wells, the bigger completions would have won out, especially in the time frame we were looking at when I did this work. And so that was really handy as well. I didn't change anything in this presentation because I didn't want to go through the get approved presentation process again. So it's exactly as it was. So I didn't have to. I just told my new boss, it's exactly what I showed before. But give you some so props to the whitSyn guys. Like, I think all these now with what he said this morning. So originally when I did this, ability to just type in the OIP and see what the line slope was, that was in there in the next week or two. After that, it sounds like this ability to save multiple save cases is solved now with the scenario. So I just heard that this morning. And then I was looking forward. I knew the multi-layer was coming, and looking forward to kind of keep it in one tool, because I was kind of doing it in 2 tools. And again, that's been implemented. So props to you guys for listening to user feedback and actually getting it in there. Can't say that for every software company, for sure. So any questions?
Quick one for you. Simple one. The 40% bigger job or more proppant fluid, was that more proppant fluid per entry point or more entry points?
That was same entry points, so more probably. Oh, let's see. How would you say that? Was the 40%? Say it again. Sorry.
40% more fluid and proppant per frac is what you tested.
Right. Yeah. So 40% more fluid and proppant per frac. Yeah, it was tested. Yep. That's right. Yeah. And so I guess I didn't mention this, but the reason we wanted when I kind of got brought in on this project, like it was already sort of in progress, but I was like, you want it big enough so that we can sort of, the idea of the 40% was, and to do it per pad, that was new for whiting as well. I was like, no, allocations are horrible here. Let's do 40% and base. They were going to do, well, this one and then that one. And it's like, having worked a few other places, I was like, our allocations aren't that good, but I wanted it big enough that it could be within, it's a big enough change that we could see it with the resolution of our tools or whatever. So it was a fairly big jump for us, but I think it paid out in the sense of we now understand what a 40% bigger frac will do and stuff. So, yeah.
When you're picking the slope in that early time, presumably those wells would still be intimately acting. Can you talk about the theoretical justification for that, or how you thought about it?
Yeah, I guess talking with reading the papers, so the question is picking the early time slopes. What's the justification because you're still in transient flow? But with the mass balance, and Ryan could probably answer this better than me, but when you're doing mass, you're basically, and you're in one basically single phase or water and oil, it'll propagate fairly fast, and we have a lot of time to a lot of headspace or whatever. So I basically just picked the biggest I could with the understanding that I probably haven't seen everything yet. And so it's basically, picking the biggest one I could for all of them. And again, it's more about in my mind, it's more about being consistent. Even if I'm consistently wrong doing that technically, it's more about the comparison because I'm just really saying, is this better than that or whatever. So that's so I wasn't 100% sure when I did that, but it's kind of kept it consistent as I've gone on.
And quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
What type of recovery factors did those yield for those wells when they were, say, 200 barrels per foot on the OIP?
The recovery factors are, they're in the, it depends on your well perm that you use in those, but yeah, they're like high 20s kind of deal for everything. But yeah.
Did you model a parent well?
No, I was wondering that was a question. No, I pretty much just ignore those. I find that, at least in the Bakken, that the parents are pretty much just along for the ride or whatever when you go back and refrac them. Yes, yeah, a bit, yeah. But we typically rod them back up, and so it's a little muted, I think, if that makes sense.
Maybe for you or anybody in the room, but kind of answer this for whom or calculating OIP. Is that something you're really using just as a relative indicator qualitatively, or are you actually trying to quantify what is my actual OIP that I'm accessing for the recovery factor? I guess
okay.
Second part of that.
Okay, hold on. I have to remember to repeat it, so it's good. Can we just take one at a time? I'm thinking now it does take like 4 or 5 questions to get that right. So your first question was, is it just a quantitative contacted OIP versus qualitative? I'd say it's both, because again, I am using that to size my XF. So if that's quantitative, I guess, to a certain extent. Like I kind of sort of set that or didn't move that too much from OIP, and then made my perm knob the more, uncertain, the more I turn the perm knob more than the XF knob after I've gone through this exercise, if that makes sense, because I feel decent that I understand the OIP better than the perm. Let's put the contacted OIP better than the perm. Is that okay? And then another question?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh.
So I think the other part too is just around really bringing in the room.
Okay.
Are you varying your static model properties like your saturation, porosity, as you move maybe to different areas, or are you just using kind of an average that's the placeholder from the universe? Sometimes other operators, if that's something that we're really looking at now.
Yeah. So the question is, do you turn the knob on the static parameters like your geo parameters and stuff? And basically, no. The Bakken, we have a lot of wells and we have a lot of data, and whiting was really down into the geologic weeds for a long, long time. So our geology feel really good about about ours, but generally, no, we just average, this would have a different, maybe a slightly different SW than this in porosity, but basically an average for the 1280 is, and then just lock that in. Figure that's better known than other stuff, including our production data sometimes, so.
Maybe with emphasizing for this method, like also the assumption on inputs here, like the manipulate something to do that. So like when you use it for downstream analysis.
Right, yeah, sorry. But SW, for instance, would be, yeah. And so, I'd pretty much keep that definitely within, 1% or 2%, but generally just accepted what the geologist thought it is.
Excellent.
Thanks.
I think with that, we'll take lunch. We'll be back at 1 Houston time, 12 p.m. Calgary time. Mountain time, I guess. I don't know what it is in Norway or people are drinking.
Okay, so for everyone on the Teams call, we'll be back here in 52 minutes and get started with the session after lunch, and we'll eat some lunch here. Food should be served out in the networking area there.